Montana Territory, August 1874, the first time Zadie Whitlow saw the man who would become her husband. He was bleeding from the forehead and standing between her and a loaded rifle. "Put the gun down, miss," he said, calm like he had not just stepped into a fight that was not his. "He is not worth hanging for." Zadie's grip on the shotgun tightened, but her hands were shaking. Behind her, her two children were crying. The man on the floor, her landlord, Elias Mercer, was groaning and holding his leg where she had kicked him after he'd tried forcing himself through her door. "He said we had till the end of the week," she breathed. "Then came early, said I could work off the rest some other way." The stranger looked down at Elias, then back to her. "You hurt him bad enough to buy time. I can fix the rest." Zadie lowered the gun, still breathing hard. "Who are you?" He tipped his hat, blood trickling down his temple. "Name is Zaylen Ridge. I owe your husband a debt. I am to pay it." "My husband is dead." Zaylen's eyes flicked to the children, a girl and a boy huddled behind the table. "I know." Zadie stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. "Then how I served with Jasper Whitlow," he said, stepping closer. "Saved my life outside Fort Shaw. Took the bullet meant for me. He said if I made it home I was to find you, help you. That was 5 years ago. Took me a while to track you." She blinked, unsure whether to believe him. "And you think showing up now makes us even?" "No, ma'am. I think marrying you might." Zadie's mouth parted, but no words came. "I know how that sounds," he added quickly, voice low and steady. "And I do not say it for myself. You and your children are one bad week from being on the street. Folks around here already talk. You marry me, Mercer backs off, and I get to pay a debt I've carried too long." Zadie looked at her daughter, Grace, clinging to her little brother Gideon. Their faces were pale, tear-streaked. "I do not even know you," she whispered. "You will," he said, "if you let me." They married in the courthouse 2 days later. No guests, no celebration. Just the judge, her children, and a man Zadie had known less than 48 hours. He never touched her that night. Slept on a cot near the hearth while she curled around Gideon in the bedroom. In the morning, he was already mending the barn roof. By the week's end, Zaylen had fixed the shutters, chased off Elias Mercer for good, and bought fresh flour from town. He brought home 3 hens and a sack of potatoes, and told the children stories about horses that could swim rivers and outrun trains. Zadie watched him from the porch, arms crossed. "Why are you still here?" Zaylen straightened from where he was teaching Gideon to tie a simple knot. "Because I said I would be. You already paid the debt. You married me." He wiped his hands on his trousers. "That was the start, not the end." She did not answer, but that night she made enough stew for a 3rd bowl and left it on the table without a word. By September, the mornings came crisp and clear, and the cabin felt less like a burden and more like a place someone could breathe. Zaylen had taken to waking early, chopping wood before dawn. Zadie often found him brushing down the mare or tending to the small garden he had started behind the house. He had fixed the broken latch on Grace's toy chest and made Gideon a carved wooden horse with a crooked smile. He never asked for thanks, never asked for anything. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, Zadie stood beside him by the fence line. They watched the kids chase each other through the tall grass, their laughter carrying across the field. "You could have walked away," she said. "I could have," he replied. "But you did not." "No." Zadie turned to him. "Why?" He looked at her, really looked like he had been waiting for her to ask. "Because Jasper died saving me, and because you were alone trying to carry everything he left behind. I figured maybe someone ought to carry some of it with you." She turned her face away, blinking fast. "I do not expect anything from you, Zadie," he said gently, "but I will not stop showing up, not until you tell me to." She nodded, throat tight. "All right." By October, Zaylin had built a second room onto the cabin. He let her pick the paint for the inside walls. She chose pale yellow. Grace began calling him Pa without being asked. Gideon followed a week later. Zadie did not say anything when it happened. Just watched from the doorway, heart twisting as Zaylin lifted Gideon onto his shoulders and ran through the yard while the boy shouted like a cavalry officer. That night, she brought a second quilt to his cot and draped it over him while he slept. He did not stir, but the next morning he handed her a cup of coffee and said, "Thank you." She met his eyes. "For what?" "For starting to trust me." By November, the snow came early. They stacked firewood high and stocked the cellar. One evening, Zadie burned her hand on the stove. Zaylin was across the room in 2 strides, pulling her hand under cold water before she could protest. "You do not have to," she started. He brushed her hair back gently. "Yes, I do." She looked up at him, close enough to see the faint scar across his jaw. "I am not made for second chances." He held her gaze. "Good thing I am not asking you to be, just asking if you will let me stay." She nodded slowly. "Yes," he smiled, soft and real. "Then I will keep showing up, every day." And he did. By early December, the ground had hardened, and the days shrank into long hours of cold light and early dusk. Zadie stood at the table, kneading bread with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hands working without thought. Outside, the wind rattled loose icicles from the eaves. Zaylin was at the workbench he'd built beside the barn, his coat dusted with sawdust. He'd taken up carving in the evenings quiet, thoughtful shapes out of pine and cedar. A whistle for Gideon, a small church for Grace, a curved spoon for Zadie's flour tin. He never asked what she thought of them. Just left them where she'd find them. That night, as she folded a quilt over Grace's feet, Zadie whispered, "You warm enough, honey?" Grace nodded, her eyes already heavy. Pa brought in the firewood. He said it burns longer if it's split thin. Zadie tucked an edge beneath her daughter's chin, her hand lingering in the stillness. "He's good to you." "He's good to you too," Grace said, voice thick with sleep. Zadie sat in the dark for a long while after both children had gone quiet. The wind had calmed outside, but something in her chest felt unsettled, like a door half open, waiting. She found him in the lean-to behind the barn, oiling the hinges on the smokehouse door. His sleeves were rolled, forearms dusted with grit. "You work past dark again," she said. He didn't look up. "It's the only time quiet enough to think." She stepped inside, her boots crunching over straw. "You planning to stay through spring?" "I'm not making plans past tomorrow unless you're in them." Zadie leaned against the wall, her arms folded. "You ever think about leaving?" "I did once," he said, "before I met you." She studied him in the dim light of the lantern. "You're a man used to moving. I see it in the way you never sit long." He set the oil can down. "I used to think stillness meant giving up something. Now I think maybe it's just making room for something better." Zadie swallowed. "I don't always know what to do with kindness." He stepped closer, slow enough she could move if she wanted. She didn't. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "Just let it be true." They stood there a moment, the cold pressing in through the walls, the space between them warm with breath. Later, she didn't go straight to bed. Instead, she poured hot water into a basin, laid out clean cloth, and waited until he came in. When he did, she sat him down at the kitchen table and took his hands, rough with work, into hers. "You've got splinters," she murmured. "I don't mind," he said. "I do." She worked them out gently, one by one, careful not to look up, but when she did, his gaze was already there, steady and quiet. "You ever miss where you came from?" she asked. "No place ever felt like mine until now." Zadie's voice caught. "Then maybe it's mine too." He didn't answer, only lifted her hand and held it between his. The next morning, she stirred bacon over the stove and set out an extra plate without thinking twice. From the window, she saw him brushing down the mare, his coat dark with frost. She opened the door and called softly. "Zalen," he turned, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Come eat before it gets cold." He smiled, a slow, worn thing that rose all the way into his eyes. She waited until he stepped inside, then said, "I want you to stay through spring, and after that." He pulled off his gloves. "Then I will." She nodded, not quite able to say more, but something in her shoulders let go. Grace and Gideon scrambled in from the back room, tugging at his coat, arguing over who got the last of the jam. He sat between them, patient, letting them divide the spoonful themselves. Zadie stood by the hearth, watching. She didn't know when her house had gotten so full, only that it had, and that he had built it quietly, steadily, one day at a time. Late December settled over the Montana territory with a stillness that pressed into every corner of the valley. Snow had gathered in soft drifts along the fence rails, and the cattle stood with their heads low, breath steaming in the brittle air. Zadie sat at the sewing table near the window, mending the hem of Grace's Sunday dress. The needle tugged rhythmically through the fabric, but her mind wandered far from the thread in her hand. Zalen was crouched by the hearth, coaxing flame from kindling. His back was to her, but his presence filled the room in that unspoken way it had begun to, not loud or pressing, just steady. Gideon lay on a blanket nearby, tracing the grain of a carved horse along the floorboards, murmuring quiet stories under his breath. "You ever think about building something bigger?" Zadie asked, eyes still on the dress. Zalen didn't turn. "Bigger how? More land, more animals." "Maybe a second barn, something that might carry past us." She paused, "something the children could keep." He fed another sliver of wood to the flames. "I've thought on it." She looked up. "And? I'd need help with the boundary surveys come thaw. And someone to take a wagon east for seed." He sat back on his heels. "But it's not just about what we can build, it's what we can hold." Zadie folded the dress neatly and stood. "I can hold more than I used to." He met her gaze then, and something passed between them that wasn't loud or sudden, just a quiet knowing that things had shifted again. The next morning, before the sun crested the ridge, they hitched the mare to the sled and rode into town. The world was hushed under snow, the trees bare and black against the white. At the mercantile, Zadie bartered for salt pork and kerosene, while Zalen spoke with the feed supplier about oat sacks and winter hay. She watched him from the corner of her eye, how he shifted his weight when listening, how he checked the stitching on burlap sacks before lifting them. He didn't talk more than necessary, but he never looked away when spoken to. Folks respected that. As they loaded the sled, a woman Zadie hadn't seen in nearly a year approached from the post office steps. Mrs. Eliza Carrington, widow of a preacher, dressed in gray wool with gloves that buttoned at the wrist. "I heard you remarried," Eliza said, glancing toward Zalen. "Didn't expect it to be so sudden." Zadie tied the last sack down. "It wasn't sudden for him, just took me longer to see it." Eliza tilted her head, skeptical. "You hardly knew the man." Zadie looked toward the sled, where Zalen was lifting Gideon up and tucking the boy's scarf around his neck without being asked. "Knowing someone's heart doesn't take years, Eliza. It takes days." "Maybe only one." Eliza said nothing more, and Zadie climbed onto the sled without looking back. They rode home through the falling snow, the quiet broken only by the creak of the runners and Gideon's soft humming. That night, Zadie lit a candle beside the bed and left the door open. Zalen paused in the doorway, his hair still damp from the wash basin, shirt tucked clean and plain into his trousers. "You sure?" he asked. She turned down the blanket beside her. "I am." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The next morning he was up early again, but this time he made coffee in silence and left a folded note on the table. Gone to the North Ridge. Fence line needs checking. Back by dusk. Zadie read it twice, then pressed her fingers to the paper. She stood a moment, letting the warmth settle over her like a quilt just pulled from the line. By the time he returned, his coat was dusted with frost, and his nose red from the wind, but his eyes lit when he saw her waiting on the porch. "I brought back more than fence reports," he said, pulling a worn canvas roll from his saddlebag. She followed him inside, where he unwrapped it to reveal a set of old land plats hand-drawn, weathered with age. "Your husband talked about this land once," he said, spreading the pages across the table. "Said he wanted to run a line of apple trees along the south rise. Said the soil there was sweet." Zadie traced the ink with her fingertip. "I remember. He said the same thing when we first came here." "I thought it was foolish." Zaylin looked at her. "Still think so?" She shook her head. "No, not anymore." He folded the plat and handed it to her. "Then we'll plant them come spring." She didn't answer, only reached for his hand, rough and cold from the saddle. He threaded his fingers through hers without hesitation. That night, as the wind howled low and long across the hills, Zadie lay beside him listening to the sound of his breathing. Neither of them spoke, but in the quiet, something settled, something that had waited a long time to rest. And they slept with their hands still clasped between them. By late January, the cold no longer startled Zadie. It was simply part of the rhythm now, like the creak of the cabin settling after sundown or the sound of Zaylin's boots brushing snow from the porch boards before he stepped inside. The world had narrowed to the steady beat of survival would split, meals cooked, children warmed, and within that, something quiet and certain had taken root. Zaylin had begun keeping a ledger in the evenings. Not just numbers and supplies, though those were there in his tight, slanted hand, but notes on the land, where the soil held moisture best, which corner of the pasture the mule deer had passed through, how many eggs the hens laid by moonlight. He didn't say what he meant to do with it, but Zadie knew. It wasn't bookkeeping, it was belonging. One afternoon she found him standing by the southern rise, gloves tucked under his belt, brow furrowed against the wind as he studied the slope. She came up behind him, pulling her shawl tighter. "You see something?" she asked. He nodded toward the bare stretch of hill. "If we clear that brush and dig proper trenches, we could run irrigation from the spring. Won't be easy, but once it's in, we could plant more than apples." Zadie narrowed her eyes against the glare. "What would we need? 2 strong hands and a season's patience." She lifted her chin. "You've already got the first." He looked at her then, and a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, not wide, not showy, just warm. "And now the second." Later, when the children were down and the fire burned low, Zadie sat across from him at the table, her hands wrapped around a tin mug. Wind rattled the window panes, but inside, the glow of the lantern softened the room. "You ever think about the kind of man you'd be if Jasper hadn't saved you?" she asked quietly. Zaylin's hand slowed where he was sharpening his knife. He set the blade down, rolling his shoulders back. "Every day I do," he said. "I was headed nowhere worth naming. He saw something in me I hadn't earned yet." Zadie watched him a long moment. "You've earned more than you know." He didn't answer right away, just picked up the blade again and ran the whetstone slow and careful along the edge. "I don't think I'd have known how to stay in one place if I hadn't met him, but it wasn't just him, it was you," she swallowed. "I was just trying to keep my children fed," he nodded. "And still, you opened the door." She stood then, crossed to where he sat, and reached for his hand. "I didn't know what I was letting in." He curled his fingers around hers. "Neither did I." The next morning, Gideon ran in from the barn with his cheeks red from the cold and a tooth in his palm. "It just fell out, Ma." Zadie crouched to inspect the gap in his smile. Well, that means you're growing. Zaylin knelt beside them. Means we'll be cutting him new boots come spring. Gideon beamed. Can I keep the tooth? You can bury it under the porch, Zaylin said. That's what my kin used to do. Keeps the bad spirits from finding it. Gideon looked thrilled by the idea and rushed off. Zadie straightened, brushing the straw from her hands. You ever plan to tell me more about where you came from? Zaylin dusted off his knees. If you want to know, I'll tell you all of it. She nodded slowly. I do. That night, after the children slept, he told her about the cattle drives in Texas, the river near Llano where he'd nearly drowned as a boy, the way his mother used to sing while pulling thread through cloth. He spoke low, like each word had weight, and Zadie listened with her hand resting over his heart. By the time the fire burned down to coals, she had tucked herself against his side, her head beneath his chin. You think your mother would have liked me? She asked. She would have loved you, he said. She'd have said you were the reason I made it home at all. Zadie closed her eyes, letting herself believe it. Come February, the ground would still be frozen, the orchard only a dream. But in that quiet stretch of winter, with the snow piled deep and the nights long, they had built something stronger than walls. And it was holding. By early March, the snow had begun to recede in wide, wet patches across the pasture. Beneath it, the earth showed dark and soft, the scent of damp loam rising in the morning air. Zaylin leaned against the fence post, sleeves rolled to the elbow, watching Gideon and Grace chase the hens through the muddy yard. Zadie stood nearby, a drying pail in one hand, her hair braided and pinned back, wisps curling at her temples from the warmth of spring rising in fits and starts. You figure they'll ever tire of chasing those birds? Zaylin asked, tipping his head toward the children. They've got more energy than sense, Zadie said, but her mouth twitched at the corners. I reckon that's the proper order at their age. He reached out, brushing a streak of dirt from her cheek with the edge of his thumb. You've got the look of someone who's planning something. She shifted the pail to her other hand. I was thinking we might take the wagon east of the ridge when the ground dries out. There's a spot Jasper once talked about, low and flat, near a bend in the creek. Might be good for planting. Zaylin nodded. Water runs strong there. I saw it when I followed the deer trail last month. Zadie's eyes met his. You didn't say. You hadn't asked yet. They stood in silence a moment, the soft clatter of chicken feet and children's laughter drifting across the yard, the scent of thaw and wood smoke thick in the air. I want to build something lasting, Zaylin, Zadie said. Not just for the children. For us. He took the pail from her hand and set it down, then reached for both of hers. Then let's build it, he said. We've already begun. That Sunday they rode into town with the children dressed in their best. Grace wore a ribbon Zadie had dyed with blackberry skin. Gideon had a collar that still didn't sit right, but he beamed when Zaylin straightened it. They walked into the church on Main Street together, not for the sermon, but to meet with Reverend Dalton. Zadie had written to him weeks before, asking if he would bless a new union, not a legal one, but one of faith and family. The kind that came after survival, after trust, after choosing again. The Reverend stood with them at the back of the empty church, the morning light filtering through the stained glass in fractured color. You've already made a life together, he said gently. This will only name what's already true. Zadie took Zaylin's hand. That's all I want. They stood before the altar, Gideon and Grace sitting quiet in the front pew, and spoke words that weren't grand, but honest. Zadie promised to keep choosing him, day after day, not because of debt or duty, but because of the peace he brought into her home. Zaylin promised to keep building beside her not just barns or fences, but something that would outlast them both. Afterward, They walked to the general store with the children, bought peppermint sticks and a new spool of thread, and rode home together under a sky that had finally cleared. In the weeks that followed, they dug into the softening earth east of the ridge. Zaylin cut channels for the water flow while Zadie planted the seed potatoes she'd saved over winter. Gideon helped tamp down the rows, and Grace kept watch for rabbits. One evening, as the last of the daylight slid gold across the field, Zadie came to where Zaylin sat sharpening the hoe. She knelt beside him, dust on her skirt, and took his hand. "I don't hear the quiet so much anymore," she said. He looked at her, brow furrowed. "It used to be loud," she said. "The stillness after Jasper died, after all that grief." She looked out over the planted rows. "But now it's just quiet, peaceful." He wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. "It's the sound of everything you've held together settling in." She leaned into his side. "It's the sound of home." That summer, the apple saplings came by freight from Helena. Zadie and Zaylin planted them as a family, each child picking a spot to press their hands into the dirt around the roots. They marked the rows with carved stakes, each one bearing a name. Grace's Hope, Gideon's Rise, Zadie's Light, and one simply marked Ridge. By the following spring, the first blossoms bloomed. Small and pale against the green, but full of promise. Zadie stood at the edge of the orchard, apron tucked at her waist, her face turned to the wind. Zaylin came up behind her, slid his hand into hers. "They'll bear fruit in a few years," he said. "I can wait," she answered. "We've already got everything else." They walked back toward the cabin together, the children ahead of them, laughing as they raced to the porch. The sun was low, the sky streaked with soft orange at the edges, and the land around them quiet in that steady, warm way that only comes when something hard-won has finally settled. Zadie paused at the doorstep, looking up at the man beside her. "I never thought I'd love again," she said. He touched her cheek, the calluses of his hand familiar now, grounding. "You didn't have to. I loved you first." She smiled, not one of relief or surprise, but of complete knowing. Then she nodded toward the open door, where the scent of stew drifted and the fire crackled low. "Come inside," she said. "Stay as long as you like," and he did for the rest of their lives.